So, good evening, everyone. March 1st today, and another moment for welcoming a guest speaker to our signature lecture in the Post-Brexit lecture series from 2016-2017. Today we have the great honor and pleasure of welcoming Professor Antoine Boucher. He comes here from Paris. He just took the train, came over, easy. He gained an hour, and he turned younger now, I think, this train, but he will have to pay the price of losing an hour when he goes home. Yeah. So, Antoine Boucher is a research professor, which is something very special and unique in France. If you're associated with the Centre National de Recherche Scientifique, that's the S. And so he wouldn't have to teach, but Antoine is actually teaching a lot, he tells me. And I also have heard that. Because he cares about students. That's one of the reasons why he will be happy to meet you. We talked about why there wasn't a paper in advance, and I explained a bit about what you've been through in the last few months, and that you will be happy to learn about his book that he brought, that's now in also English translation, Democratizing Europe, and also the many other writings that he has. If you look at his CV, there's a whole list of very accessible publications, but we spared you having to read the paper for today, given that you have had various deadlines for today. You read a big book last night. Anyway, so thank you for coming, and thank you, Antoine, for coming, because your voice has been a very important one in the debate over the fate of Europe in the last few years. And we've looked at the reasons for Brexit and the developments from a variety of angles now, but I think that your angle and your political science, but also sociological eye, and in fact you believe in the EU, is an important contribution to the debate, because here in the UK it's a bit questionable right now what people believe, because we worry about what happens in the UK, whereas you say that you can shed light a bit on what's happening in the EU. So thank you so much for making time.
Thank you, Pierre. I'm very honored to be invited to present my research and indeed somehow unusual book that I wrote, because I'm a researcher and I wrote a number of research articles, a number of research books, but then at some point I got the opportunity in the context of the 2014 elections of the European Parliament, it's already 2 years ago now or more, to write a little book, an essay, a very short one. It's 100 pages, so I'm a little bit ashamed to present such a small book, but the idea being to try to bring together a variety of new research in the field of sociology, political science, critical legal studies also, vis-a-vis regarding the EU and its historical trajectory. The initial enigma, in a way, that I had in mind is, how does it come that after 25 years of reforming treaties, we've, among other objectives of the reformers, the idea of democratizing Europe, bringing a variety of tools within the treaties, from the Single European Act to the Lisbon Treaty, of bringing the Parliament into the game, giving it political power in terms of control, in terms of legislation, giving citizens initiative, in the Lisbon Treaty, a variety of instruments that you find now, in the European treaties. And if you read the European treaties, they're quite striking in terms of democratic credentials. They're, very much up to date. You find, the standards of representative democracy. You find also participative democracy. It says all the time that, ONG and the civil society should be associated to decisions. You also find elements of direct democracy. I was saying, petitioning. You also find, democracy through law, type of tradition, through, of course, the Court of Justice, the rule of law, and the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So, in a way, there's everything there, and there has been a lot of work in engineering, you know, the best possible institutional setup. And by many standards, again, it's probably very advanced. And despite all of these attempts, it seems that, and the Eurozone crisis seems to have shown that quite strikingly, you know, that the place where decisions are taken, in a way, is still somehow distanced from the place where democratic institutions are working. And in particular, it's particularly true, of course, of the role, very marginal role, of the European Parliament during the whole Eurozone crisis, where it was essentially the, you know, Mario Draghi, probably the German and the French ministries of economics, the Commission and its economic departments that were basically, you know, the pilots of that crisis. So I came to the idea that there was something more, you know, structural to be found in the way EU polity had emerged historically, that could explain this, you know, this resistance to democratic pressures, if you want, democratic reform that, you know, eventually ends up always with, you know, sort of democratic deficit, to say it briefly. And this also came to me, you know, as a, you know, an idea of research, as I had just finished a book that took me quite a lot of time to work on, to write on the role of lawyers, the role of law, EU, in the making of, you know, the European, of EU polity, the role of legal milieu in shaping, in providing, in a way, the unity or the overall institutional framework for EU polity. And it came to my mind that, you know, there might be something particular in the trajectory of the institution of Europe that was related to some nexus between power and knowledge, between you know, the emergence of this particular center of power that is Europe, and the emergence of specific institutions and the emergence of specific bodies of knowledge in law, in economics, etc. And this all somehow, at some point, converged around one word that came to my mind as being quite central, although it was up everywhere, but in a way I had never noticed that it was so central in this government that of Europe. And the word was independence, independent powers, independence from representative politics, independence from party politics. This word is, in a way, a word that is ubiquitous today, of course not only in EU politics, but it's a word that you know, is the legitimation ground for a variety of institutions, not only in the field of law. Of course, everybody thinks about courts, constitutional courts, that in a way ground their legitimacy in being exterior to you know, partisan politics or representative politics, but also in the field of economics with the European Central Bank, and in the field, you could say, of regulation with agencies that have become regulatory agencies that have come to play a bigger and bigger role. If you think still about independence, you see that in the framework of the EU, it seems that it is very much the condition to provide some central EU public goods in terms of securing free competition with DG Comp within the European Commission that is very independent and under the control of the European Court of Justice, which is an independent institution. Of course, the rule of law under the supervision of the European Court of Justice, monetary policy and the stability of price, which is under the rule of the European Central Bank, banking supervision and the financial stability, which is under now the supervision of the European Central Bank and its supervision mechanism, etc., etc. It's in a way a very pervasive notion, legitimation ground in a way in EU politics. You even have a new type, I would say, of political leadership, of independent political figures, you would say. People like Mario Draghi, the savior of the euro. So it is said, the one who came and decided, said that he would do whatever it takes to save the European Monetary Union, presenting himself as the guardian of the euro, presenting himself, the independent, the figure, the non-elected person. You can also think about Jacques Delors, the hero of the single market, an economist brought to power by Mitterrand and nominated as a president of the Commission, who, whose heroic somehow, role in shaping the market and relaunching the European construction in the 1980s is now told and retold in a way. And you also, of course, think about the original tale of that, which is La méthode Jean Monnet. Jean Monnet, the founding father. Who is Jean Monnet? He's certainly not an elected politician, but he is a businessman turned into a technocrat and inspiring Robert Schuman in the early 50s to write the Coal and Steel Community. So you have here a notion, the notion of independence, that is very pervasive, but at the same time very difficult to define. Lawyers talk a lot about independence, but I've been looking for definitions of independence, and they're very diverse. The centers of independence are very different from one country to another. So it is really something that is very difficult to define. Sometimes, often, it's taken as something quite self-explanatory. Independence, everybody has an idea of what is an independent judge, impartial. But, the exact meaning of that remains rather fuzzy. So, in front of this centrality of the notion of independence, in front of the centrality of independent roles in the EU, in front of this emerging type of political leadership, such as Mario Draghi or Jacques Delors, or of course Jean Monnet historically, in front of the fact that essential public goods are considered to be best delivered if delivered by independent institutions that are not part of the representative circuits of democracy, then I come to look at this notion of independence in the context of the EU. Of course, there is a number of studies on the centrality on independent institutions. There is a number of works on the European Court of Justice. They're very rich. There's also a lot of things on the European Central Bank. I'm not going to quote. Gian Domenico Maione, just to quote one, is very famous to have worked on regulatory agencies, and their centrality in EU government. But the fact is, they remain very sector-specific studies. Often the lawyer will look at the court, the economist will look at the central bank, the political scientist will look at the regulatory agencies. But the question of the fact that this legitimatory ground is invoked by various institutions, quite different one from one another. One, in the field of economics, of law, of public policies, has not been actually questioned. The fact that there is such an entanglement between the notion of independence and the legitimacy to govern Europe, to govern the supranational institutions of Europe, and to, in a way, embody the European project, is something, in a way, that remains an enigma. In a way, we have not thematized independence as such. We have looked at courts and looked at the emergence of the European Court of Justice. We've looked at the central bank and the heroic history of the European Central Bank. But we've not questioned how is it that, this notion is so pervasive? And is there something, as I hypothesize, something particular about the EU that makes the independent powers and the notion of independence so central in the government of Europe? And this is, in a way, my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that there is a singular political formula of the EU. And in the political formula of the EU, that is historically built, it's not something that comes, there is a deep connection between independence and the capacity and the legitimacy to govern. Let me make the point more clearly. I think, very briefly, in national settings, in France, in the UK, the emergence of independent institutions, central banks, regulatory agencies, courts, constitutional courts, supreme courts, in a way have emerged to delimit the realm of political decision, to control, and avoid that the realm of politics be too wide, and delimit a little bit in terms of defending human rights against the majorities, or defending the stability of monetary policy against electoral interests, etc. But what I argue is that in the case of the EU, it's actually the contrary. In the case of the EU, I would argue, and I would like to show that historically, is that the very lever through which Europe has accumulated political capacity is actually through these independent institutions. They have been the one opening a political space. They have not been the ones delimiting or containing politics. They actually have been the ones that have made an institutional terrain for Europe, and that have actually made, created the political capacity of Europe. So, in a way, they are central. They are the core, in a way, and the institutions of representative politics, in a way, like the European Parliament, for example, have come later and have remained, in a way, at the periphery. So, in a way, paradoxically, political authority, in terms of representative democracy, if you want, the institutions of representative democracy, are at the periphery, and the independent institutions are at the core. And of course, my argument in this renversement, this English, it's exactly the contrary to schematize, from historically the way independent institutions emerged nationally. I think this has, of course, enormous consequences on how you can or you cannot democratize Europe. Because, of course, in a polity that is built around independent institutions, around expertise, and where the civil society is a civil society that is in dialogue with these expert and independent institutions, it's of course a very different type of politics than the politics of parties or representative politics. So, and Pierre, please, if I'm going beyond, when I get to the time limit, could you just let me know, because I know I tend to be. No, you won't do that?
The students insisted that we go longer today.
Okay, no, but it was then, if you, when the students can, you can waive me and no, because if you want to engage in discussion. Okay, and so in a way, what I want to point in this book, it's this particular political formula that is Europe, that actually could be explaining the sort of, difficulty to democratize Europe through, the building of this democratic parliamentary, or the strengthening of the parliament, etc. So to try to open up in a way this political formula to understand, in a way my toolbox, analytical and conceptual toolbox, is historical and sociological. I'm trying to understand how this particular polity has emerged, coalesced historically, how this particular political formula that is Europe has emerged. And there's no better way, in a way, to understand, the present, the institutional terrain on which Europe is actually moving today. No better way than making a historical detour. So, I'm using history here as a methodological tool. I'm not a historian. I'm using history to a little bit understand how this singular story of Europe has unfolded over years. And of course, this is not a work that I could have done only on my own. To write a little book, in a way, you need much more, and allow yourself, in a way, with quite, short sentences and hypotheses that, are quite somehow as strong as possible. Well, you need actually more scholarship. So your own scholarship is not enough, and I have to, mention the emergence of, a sociology of elites, of EU elites in particular, that I've drawn quite a lot from. The emergence also, a surge of interest in, the history of forms of knowledge of Europe. How have we got to know Europe? Through which sort of instrument? What sort of knowledge in economics, in law, etc. And of course, history of law. So it's quite an interdisciplinary type of work. So I'll make 3 points, essentially, to go through that presentation. The first is historical, precisely. Is to get, in a way, to a sort of inaugural scene, when initially this particular political formula got defined, debated, and defined. And in a way, my idea is that, strangely enough, in the classic historiography of the European Union, of its integration, the making of the market, the economic community of the Rome Treaty, appears to be just, one step, but historians have not been so interested in this, very technical and, to them, sector-specific type of integration in the market. They were more interested, in a way, in big political big bangs, big political crises, the beginning with Robert Schuman in the 1950s, then the Gaullist moment, and the empty chair crisis, So years of, as we say in French, un temps mort, a temps mort of the integration in the 60s, continuing in the 70s with the economic crisis in Europe, and then the comeback of Europe in the 80s with Delors, the Single European Act, François Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl, the German and the French heads of state, the prime minister. Well, and again, relaunching politically Europe. So this is a very politically centered history of Europe, and we've for a long time lived with that history, and in a way we have underestimated the political importance of market making, of the common market. Because after all, contrarily to what historians of that historiography think, it's not just one step, it's not just a sector-specific, the market, the building of the European market. It is actually the first EU, EC at the time, European Community, policy. And as the first EU, EC policy, it's also the first, in a little bit, the cradle of Europe, the moment when a particular type of political authority is defined. And of course, this is a story that has been told in a way. The 1960s and the 1970s are not a temps mort of European integration. They're actually a moment when, of course, political leaders, for a variety of reasons, are not gathering to relaunch and write new treaties. But this is a moment when a particular interpretation of what European treaties are about is emerging. And it's emerging under the lead of two institutions, the European Court of Justice and the European Commission, making the market and turning these treaties, which were actually, complex. They were not just about making free movement, freedom of circulation. They were about many things. They were about there were various policies, actually various treaties, a variety of institutions. But the joint work of the Commission and the Court in the 1960s has been to, in a way, transform this scattered, rather undefined treaties into what, a de facto constitution, into an institutional terrain built around the idea that the treaties were a constitution and they were essentially about making a market. Here, I've worked a lot in a previous book called Brokering Europe on one case, very famous, uber famous, case of European Court of Justice, Wangen and Loos, which is often taken just as, a case delivering a decision on direct effect of European law in national legal systems. But what I've been trying to show is that it's actually not just one decision. It's actually a moment where a variety of groups in the Commission, in the European Parliament, in the European Court of Justice, lawyers around that were getting interested in building this European community, actually coalesced around the Court of Justice, around this Wangen and Loos decision, 1963, to participate, to a little bit settle a definition of what Europe is about what the European project is about. And it's essentially through this mobilization, if you want, of lawyers across institutions, in the institutions and at the periphery of European institutions, the definition of the EU as the European treaties as a constitution. And of course, in a constitution, the interpretation of a constitution doesn't come down to politicians or diplomats. Those who actually have the leading role in a constitution, in interpreting a constitution, particularly in the framework of the EU, here is the European Court of Justice and the European Commission. They are given some sort of objective role, as in the case of the European Court of Justice, defending the unity of EU law and its implementation all across Europe. So that's an objective task in a way, the police of the treaties, the legal police of the treaties. And the Commission, the task to embody general interest of the treaties and of the European project. So, my idea here is that this is an inaugural moment, a moment when the treaties, you know, the Rome treaties, they were not actually very much in favor of independent institutions. The Rome treaties had been, had been considered to be very intergovernmental at the time. But through this process of redefinition that happens in the 60s and in the 70s, it turns into something very different. It turns into something that is really not that much intergovernmental. And it turns into something where two institutions that are independent from partisan politics, from national interests, from diplomatic groups, are actually embodying the European project and its general interest. So that's one first point. The second point is more about then a little bit the portraying of these institutions that are yeah, okay, very good. So the portraying of these institutions, I think what is interesting here is that a link has been built, a connection has been established between being independent, being secluded and distanced from states' interests, partisan politics, national diplomats, and the capacity to embody the general interest of Europe. And this connection has been established historically. It's complex. Was not made in one day, in a way, and it's still contested. In part, it goes through, in part only, the fact that these institutions have claimed from themselves what one judge of the European Court of Justice called un supplément d'objectivité, a supplement of objectivity vis-à-vis party politics and national interest of diplomats, embodied by diplomats. A supplement of objectivity. And how have they established this supplément d'objectivité? First of all, through their capacity to build knowledge instruments about Europe. Instruments that are able to create an idea of the state of Europe, the economic state of Europe, the legal state of Europe, and to have a sort of panopticon, view of Europe that each one of the member states is incapable of having. So the Commission, for example, has built the Eurobarometer that measures the public opinion. The European Commission has built Select's database that is now very famously called Eurolex. It's the website where you look for EU law, which is a database that, in a way, is built around the idea of direct effect and autonomy of EU law. The European Central Bank today is producing continuously statistics and is able to produce vis-a-vis ministries of economics a view of the state, the economic and monetary state of Europe that no state is able to. That's one element. A second element is not only knowledge instrument, what I call the cognitive advantage, but it's also an analytical capacity, a capacity to build the theories of Europe, the theories that in a way orient our view of Europe and our view of the states in the EU. Just take there's a little time, so just to the example of the European Central Bank I've been working on also recently, which has an in-house research center that is considered to be one of the most productive of the European Union, in the world actually. It's actually the 6th department of economics in terms of bibliometry in Europe, which means that it has a capacity not only to decide monetary policy, but it has a doctrinal capacity, a capacity to build diagnosis through the knowledge instruments, but also orient and interpret this diagnosis through theories of Europe that actually make sense of what sort of political choices could be made. And it's very important to study, again, that's why I was mentioning the nexus between power and knowledge. Independent powers around the EU, they have established around themselves not only institutions, but also knowledge communities, knowledge instruments, and part of their capacity and part of their political authority lies in the fact that they are recognized by knowledge communities of lawyers, of economists, of political scientists, as authoritative institutions building forms of knowledge, etc. I will end up with a brief remark in the line of that, meaning that, so they have claimed for themselves a particular access to, the general interest of Europe. A little bit like the medieval lawyers studied by Kantorowicz. I don't know if you worked on Kantorowicz, this famous historian of law, where actually building the notions of bien commun, of general interest, that was something that was maybe asked by the kings, but ultimately, historically, imposed themselves to the kings, were stronger to the kings, and were, in a way, superior to the figure of the king. And a little bit, the notion of, the notion of the European project, the way it has been defined by these independent institutions through tools of economics, through tools of law, in a way also have built not the notion of crown, the way medieval lawyers would build, but a notion of European project. That is something that in a way is considered by these institutions or part of the people who lead them as something supra-electoral that has to be defended despite the changes of electoral majorities. It has to be defended against national interests, and it has to be perpetuated, and they, in a way, have defined their roles as being the guardians of this. And of course, that will be my last word, but maybe opening to discussion. The polity that has emerged in the building of the market around these institutions, namely the European Court of Justice, the European Commission, and the European Central Bank, the polity that has emerged around this institution, which of course looks like, in a way, the institutions that I've described, it is a polity or a public space of experts. The threshold to participate to EU affairs is higher by many regards to the threshold that is required to participate to national political affairs. And if you look at the profile, the sociological profile of MEPs, you have 25% of them who have a PhD. If you look at the profile of the policy officers, the lobbyists, the lawyers that actually work in Brussels, they are of course knowledge professionals. And even unionists or activists know that if they want to be efficient in Brussels, they have to select within themselves the ones that actually look the most like Brussels, if you want, have the credentials to be efficient in Brussels. So they won't send the guy who's actually rioting on the barricade in Paris. They will send the one who looks more like the institutions I've described, meaning more experts, more credentials in economics or law, but probably in a way also more depoliticized. Thank you for your attention.
Floor is open. Tommaso.
Yeah. First question. The title of your book is Democratizing Europe, right? I find this interesting because I have the impression by this presentation that you actually are not inviting to more democracy in Europe, or at least representative democracy, the classical idea of democracy. And then, if I may, the second one, and is you talk about political leaders that are independent authority.
Sorry, independent?
Authority.
Yeah.
I find quite interesting in a classical way, because when you say political and independent, then you talk about Mario Draghi. It's the example, and is Mario Draghi independent when he's playing the role of politician? Can we be independent? In which sense? And then we say what Germany is pushing to replace Mario Draghi with give to Italy the presidents of Parliament in order to gain the presidents of the central bank. Start with three questions.
Okay. Should I answer right away? Yeah. Okay. Well, no. I mean, you're perfectly right. What I should have said, in a way, being a scholar, I'm not coming out with a reform plan for Europe. This is not my task in a way. But what I can do is point at the fact that maybe our failure to reorient or to democratize Europe also is connected to our failure to describe Europe as it is. My point in the book, in a way, is that we have continuously confused Europe as it is, in fact, essentially driven by this market institution, and Europe as EU institutions say it is, and if you look at the treaties, there's a lot of political words, and Europe as we would like it to be, which is even something else, depending on each one of us. And we have in a way confused all of that. And I think the operation I'm trying to do here is a bit, let's just look at Europe as it is. And in a way, if we look at Europe as it is, centered around these independent institutions, and the polity, the specific type of polity, a very specific type of public sphere that emerges around these expert institutions, then we understand that the issue is not to give more powers to the European Parliament, or not only at least. The issue is to bring also these institutions that actually play a very important political role, they are central politically speaking, to bring them back in a way in the democratic conversation. The democratic, quite strikingly, again, 25 years of reforming treaties and almost no discussion about, you know, European Court of Justice, the nomination of these judges, or the European Central Bank. You know, in a way, strikingly, we have concentrated all our reform thinking about the parliament and building a sort of mimicking parliamentary democracy at the EU level. But neglecting the fact that the center of gravity of the EU is not, is very much this triptych of institutions. So, and well, I don't want to be too long, but yeah, I mean, on Draghi, what I'm saying is that, yeah, in the framework of the EU, Draghi is playing a political role in the sense that he is the leader that says, I am the defensor in last instance of the European Monetary Union. So he's playing de facto political role. But of course he's not, and he will never say that he is a politician, of course. But I'm just trying to put the sort of situation that is striking this sort of emerging political class, if you want, of the EU. People like Mario Monti. Are you Italian? Mario Monti, Draghi. They are professors. They are high, central bankers like Draghi. But they play a central political role. And even when they go back to Italy, they actually become political leaders. If you take Papademos, the vice president of the European Central Bank, in the framework of the crisis, in the framework of the Greek crisis, when he came back in Athens, he became the prime minister. So it's not me saying they are political leaders. It's their credentials as independent that makes them statesmen in specific situations of crisis. Yes, and I'll be briefer, sorry.
Yeah, I think you can say that the independence of these European institutions have allowed national parliaments, or the actual politicians, to blame the European institutions for everything they want to. And today the Commission presented this white paper with 5 options for the future of Europe, basically telling the member states, well, now you decide. So what, if any, signs do you read from this in maybe a turning point of the independence?
I've not read actually the
well,
white
I mean,
paper.
it's just 5 different
Yeah, no,
options.
I saw it came out, but I didn't read. So what would be the question? Sorry.
If any signs you read from the Commission saying in public to the member states, now you decide, rather than setting out a strategy itself, if you could sort of see a change in giving up of independence.
Well, I mean, the case of the Commission is interesting because they have, among the 3 independents that I've described, the Commission is a special case because ever since the beginning, there have been strong attempts to define the Commission as the government of Europe, in a sort of face-to-face relationship with the Parliament, and both institutions reinforcing, in a way, politically one another. But at the same time, the strength of the Commission comes very much from its regulatory power. There is something non-political, in a way. If you consider, the regulations of the single market, the free competition of DG Comp, regulated by DG Comp. So when Juncker arrives and says, I'm going to make a more political Commission, as he wanted to do, he can do that. He can, make declarations. But at some point, there's a limit point, to this strategy, because you can, politicize more the discourse of the Commission. But when you touch to the fundamental policies, the réacteur nucléaire, if you would say in French, of the European Commission, the single market and the competition policy, then you have Schäuble saying, as he did, the Ministry of Finance of Germany, well, saying, well, if you start politicizing the single market and the competition policy, then we will bring them out of the Commission and create independent agencies. So in a way, you know, the Commission has to deal with this strong historical identity of his, that is, to be a market builder. And you cannot politicize suddenly such an institution and say, you know, I am a government. And so this is a little bit the dilemma, I think, of this institution.
We said that European Union was born relying on the independent institution. And so my question is, do you think that European Union could have been created in another way? So relying instead, for example, on representative democracy? Or relying on independent institution was the only way to create Europe?
That's a very
easy one.
That's an easy question. Yeah, of course I have your solution. I mean, I think, I mean, the interest of turning back to history is indeed to show a variety of moments of bifurcation of, you know, of the way political leaders thought about the European project and the way, you know, institutionally to build it. And indeed, I mean, there's a number of moments when this political formula could have been, in a way, contested. For example, when the European Parliament started to be elected directly, you know, from 1979, and it attempted to say, well, now that, you know, Spinelli, who was a famous left-wing politician, member of the European Parliament, leader of the, you know, so very famous and essential figure of the pan-European movement. He was member of that first parliament elected directly. And he launched a movement saying, we are the constituent assembly of Europe, and we are writing a constitution. We don't need states. We don't need you know, the European Commission. We are the people, and we are writing this constitution. This was a moment when you could, you know, something, and it failed in a way miserably, you would say, because you know, no one actually recognized to the European Parliament that capacity to write a constitution on its own, but only to propose a constitution that then the member states, and Mitterrand and Kohl would actually rewrite as an international treaty or a European treaty. And then, of course, you know, the party was over, or the game was over. So, you know, there is a number of moments when, like the empty chair crisis with de Gaulle. Yeah, I mean, but I mean, in a way, when you look at this way, you could also think that this the settlement, the institutional setup of today is also something that is contingent to a certain extent, and that offers also a variety of ways to maneuver. If you consider, you know, the margins of maneuvering that the ministries of economics have found during the Eurozone crisis in rewriting the economic government of Europe, of the Eurozone, the freedom that they have taken with the principles of you know, the unity of EU law, writing treaties that are international and not EU. You know, the stability mechanism, the fiscal compact, international treaties. Well, I mean, it's striking, you know, how, you know, we always say, you know, this is so, it looks so irréformable, no? Too difficult to change. But when you look at moments of crisis, you see how much margins of maneuvering political leaders manage to find. And in the dealing with the Eurozone crisis, the principles that looked so strong and unavoidable were actually set aside by, you know, Merkel, Sarkozy, and Draghi. I mean, I'm making it a bit schematic, but there's something true about that. You just have to look at the Treaty of the Stability Mechanism and the Fiscal Compact.
Dr. Barrett.
Thank you. I just had a thought that maybe follows on from the question, and I enjoyed your donut pictures about the institution being in the centre and then representing democracy
Okay,
on the outside. So
the donut,
I drew these pictures, and I wondered maybe there's an inevitability about that structure because of the direction of travel of power. So if you're kind of looking at the history of the EU, I think you also need to look at the history of member states and how they arrived at these representative democracies. And that's taking away power from a monarch or some kind of institution that already existed there, that had some divine power and people took from it. Whereas when you're creating the EU, you're giving over that power to something else. And what do you give that to? Well, you give it maybe to an institution.
No. That's an interesting interesting point. I mean, my image of I like the dotted image. Thank you for suggesting that. Some of the fun but it was more related to you know, the history of European states ever since the late 19th century. You know, from the emergence of independent central banks, the emergence of Supreme Courts or constitutional courts, and you know, from a situation where representative politics and party politics, say at the turn of the 19th century, early 20th century, was quite strong in a way, you know. And so that's more that story that I was referring to. But yes.
In the framework you outline, where is and which is the role and the place of the Council and the European Council? Because, for example, if I think about the migrant crisis, I think that the incapacity to deal with migrants arriving to Europe is mainly due to the incapacity in the Council to reach an agreement, and therefore my view of the problem is that the appeal to independence is more a narrative to gain legitimacy than what is really happening and what is the real structure of Europe.
Well, first of all, I want to point out one thing. When I use independent, it's a complex. I mean, what is complex about using the word is that it's a folk category. It's a category of the actors themselves. I'm not buying, or I'm not buying the fact that they're independent, but I'm not even actually questioning the fact that they're not. I'm not interested in knowing whether they're actually independent from national member states or not. Actually, if I look at Draghi, for example, Draghi, you know, as all EU politicians or as all EU leaders, is very much nationally rooted and is very much connected to the Italian bureaucracy or economic bureaucracy and central banking. So, first of all, I don't think independence is possible, or if it's not, I mean, in the framework of the EU again, if it's not given to leaders that are considered to be somehow connected nationally. These new political statesmen that I'm talking about, they are chosen still by the Council, the European Council, you know, that chooses the judge of the court, the central bankers. So they don't choose people that they feel won't actually have the sense of national interest also. But, you know, once they're in position, that's a different story. So that's one thing. Then it's a good remark. Of course, I've not talked at all about the Council. And about the Council of Ministers, about the European Council. And I'm not saying that it has no importance. How could I say that? It's central. But there are two things. First of all, I think the gravity force, if you want, of this independent branch I'm talking about also spans within the Council. What does it mean? It means, first of all, that during the crisis, for example, the Eurozone crisis, the way political leaders in the Council thought about building trust, rebuilding trust in the euro money, the currency, rebuilding trust vis-à-vis the financial market, was essentially through building new independent institutions or giving more power to independent institutions. Of course, it's Sarkozy or Merkel who did it, but they were already somehow convinced that to build European institutions that are trustworthy, that are not dominated by big states, or that in which smaller states can actually have confidence, or that can actually build rational policies or expert-driven policies. You have to delegate to independent powers. So that's why the European Central Bank is now also supervising all private banks in the European Union, which is not a little competence. This is why they have built a European semester, controlling the budgetary convergence of member states, etc. So that's the first thing. The influence, the gravity force spans in the Council because political leaders and bureaucracies, economic bureaucracies, national economic bureaucracies, are themselves profoundly taken by the idea that you need independent powers to build European institutions. The second thing is that the Council itself, like the European Council in this case, when it emerged in the 70s, because it didn't exist before the 70s, to become somehow a credible interlocutor to the Commission, they have built a very powerful general secretariat of the Council. It's very famous because it's really a strong bureaucracy. And what is this bureaucracy about? The Secretariat General of the Council, one of the first things that they have managed or done is to recognize the fact, in a way, to put it briefly, to recognize this doctrine of EU legal order, for example, to recognize the sort of de facto constitutional interpretation of the treaties, to recognize, in a way, the centrality of the Commission, even if they contest it more than other institutions, and of the European Court of Justice. The monopoly of the European Court of Justice, for example, in interpreting EU law. So in a way, to become an EU institution, they have, in a way, paid their due. They have, in a way, complied to this common, this sort of EU common sense, if you want, of recognizing the centrality of this independent institution. So I'm not saying the Council doesn't has renounced to defend the interest of states, but I'm saying it does so on the terrain that has been defined previously by these independent institutions. It does so with the tools that have been given to them in a way. For example, this legal order, definition of the EU law as an autonomous and hierarchically superior legal order, playing with that and within that framework. Yes, please.
So, in your first part of the lecture, you gave a descriptive account of the current state.
Yeah.
And then in your second part of the lecture, you made 3 points. How do these two parts relate to each other? Is the second part application of case study of the first part? That's the first question.
No, but I mean, so I'm sorry if I was not clear enough, but my point is, to raise an enigma initially. The enigma was, how is it that so many attempts to democratize, so much engineering? And I mean, I don't know any other polity that has been so obsessed with its own reform, with its continuous, attempt to democratize. Yeah, there's a goodwill in the EU that you cannot, not recognize in a way. So I mean, and all these attempts have failed. So I mean, and in a way, my questioning is then, is there something more structural about the way this polity has been defined, about the way this institutional terrain on which these institutions actually, struggle, compete, etc., is actually, made and defined. And then that led me in a way to these 3 points where I've tried first to sketch a little bit historically the sort of inaugural moment, and second to portray a little bit this institution through their claim of embodying the general interest. And the third point, I admit, due to lack of time, I didn't develop that much. But the idea was to, and I just mentioned it very briefly in the end, to show how these institutions actually shape the polity that surround them. And I mentioned that in saying that, the polity that is that has autonomized, particularly in Brussels, is a polity that in large part is emerged in the continuation and alongside the principles and type of credentials of these expert institutions. So that's basically what I'm trying to do. So the enigma, in a way, is resolved. I don't know if it's resolved, but my answer to the enigma of this resistance to democratization is that there is a specific structure of, you could say, of the field of EU power that is, it's not a democratic public sphere in the sense of the public sphere made alongside the way, I don't know, Habermas could have defined that. It's a public sphere of specialists. It's a public sphere of built along public policies. So in that particular type of public policy, public sphere, of course, it's much more resistant to democratization. It's much more. It's given the social structure of EU elite, of this field of power. Of course, there's more resistance to democratization. So that's, in a way, how I get back to the first point.
So just quickly
Is that clear?
Yeah, very clear.
Okay.
Quickly follow up. So the resistance in the reflected in the Brexit vote were based on immigration, some economic regulation, and some human rights issues. But immigration is linked with the international Middle East war. So what I'm trying to say is, actually the institutional setup, there isn't not much of a problem at all, just like domestic specialization, separation of powers. Is the contingent development in the either the globalized world or in domestic politics are the problem, and the reaction from
Well, for me the two are related.
Mm-hmm.
Because in a way, these institutions that I'm describing, they have really built. They are the market. They have built this market. This, the most powerful market in the world, in a way, and this is where the EU as a political capacity in market regulation. You know, it's this, and who's actually embodying or representing the EU? It's the Commission, you know, in trade negotiations with the United States. And when, you know, and I think multinationals like Apple, Google, or Microsoft, they know that the EU actually counts and has political capacity. And they know that this political capacity lies in a way less in the heads of state than in the Court of Justice. You know, and in the way the Court of Justice actually sanctions for unfair competition, Apple or Google or whatever. Putin, he knows very well that when the EU is starting to build a market, a common market with Ukraine, it's actually not just about the market, because it's actually giving a lot of political capacity to the EU and to the rules that are the market rules that are defined by the Commission and the Court, etc. So I think this institutional setup that I've described, whose history I tried to describe, is actually very politically meaningful outside of the EU. And I think we always say, oh, the EU is incapable of, but when it comes to market regulation, I think everybody from multinationals to big states recognize that these EU institutions, particularly the Court and the Commission, but also the Central Bank, have a strong political capacity. So it's not just you know, a term of balance of power within the EU, I think.
If I may. So, if you study, and if you've been studying the EU for a long time now, then of course you go through certain phases of realizing what is your particular take, what are your preferences. So in this sociology of the actors that have shaped the EU, you could say that you're part of this, you know, sociologie de profession, and these colleagues also that are with you in this book. And in some sense, that is really helpful, and it builds on work that other people have been doing in order to understand who are the characters and what are the contingencies in which these people shape the EU. But in some sense, I wonder, and because that relates also to the way that lawyers define their role in political scientists. So what are the defining moments or the crises that really challenge us to do it differently than we've used to? So the sociology of professions, or what you call the metaphysics, right? There's certain role, the role that certain sciences have played to explain this strange enigma of the EU. We could just continue to do that and refine our methods, or we say, or we have to come to a point where we ask really critically, are we asking the right questions? And in some sense, you know, so what are the triggers for that? So in London right now, EU scholars and teachers meet and they discuss what the institution's roles should be in fostering EU studies. Some law schools actually worry about whether they should still offer EU law in such a prominent way, and then they all get quite alerted if a prominent school in London says, we will continue to make this a core module because there's still interest. So these are, I don't know, symptoms of at least a certain state of nervousness. But now, around this Brexit debate and Trump's election, people turn away from hero stories, right? So it's not so much about the founders or the great figures, but it's about trying to identify those that are affected by all this, that we haven't heard them. So as a Europeanist, where does one, or where should one look to understand those that feel that they are really too far away from, you know, even after direct election in the European Parliament, they still feel that they're really not part of this. And if we see work cropping up in the US and elsewhere, in England as well, about those that somehow we've never understood. They're rural, what we would have called the rural classes. And there's books everywhere now, and studies of sociologists have said, well, it's true, for years now, I've been trying to understand what the simple person thinks. So where do we find those studies in Europe? Like with the rise of populism, we need to understand better, know where that comes from. So while I think this work is important, it needs to be complemented by looking also at the non-big actors.
I fully agree with you, and this is certainly a little bit the limit of the exercise of writing a very small book. But I'm going to take up 2 points. First is, scholars, precisely because these independent institutions have, established part of their legitimacy through the building of theories, the building of knowledge instruments. Scholars have been, in a large part, enrolled in that project. Lawyers, EU lawyers, the specialists of EU law, emerged as a community in close relation with the Court of Justice, with the Commission, the main association of scholars of EU law. I think still today meets during the weeks when the European Court of Justice doesn't have audiences, sessions, in order for judges to be able to come. Because there's a sort of, to these conferences, because there's a sort of sense that it's a co-production, EU law is a co-production, and EU lawyers have a role to play in the advancement of EU law, in the progress of EU law as a project. And in a way, I think there is now a critical turn within EU law and EU law scholarship. I'm taking part to a conference in a couple of days in Florence, just actually Friday and Saturday, a book coming out called EU Law Stories that I warmly recommend, and it's a book that brings together scholars, historians, sociologists, lawyers, and what they do is the purpose of the book is to take the cases, the landmark cases of the European Court of Justice, that we get to know now just through one sentence, Mangan-Low's direct effect, to reopen these cases and to look at the conflicts, the competing, historical futures in a way that were debated at the time of the decision. Between various lawyers, between various groups. And so there's a critical turn in the EU in somehow distancing oneself from this role of the EU lawyer, as the court was saying, the former president of the European Court of Justice was saying to EU lawyers, you're the private army of the European communities. In the sense that they were really, the soldiers, defending the project. And of course we are far from that today. There's much more. It would be infamous in a way, ridiculous on my side not to recognize that EU law scholarship has changed a lot from the 1960s. But still, there is this tension on how much we're useful for the court as lawyers, how much we define our role as being, the private army of the European Court of Justice, or how much we define our role as, in a way, public intellectuals, critical, bringing, in a way, the interpretations of what lies in the decisions, what lies politically, economically, in the various decisions of the European Court of Justice. So unveil a little bit, what is political in the decisions of the European Court of Justice. That's the first point. I'll be brief on the second one, but I think this is a huge research terrain. The other side of my story, if you want, is in a polity that is defined with a very high threshold to engage in EU affairs because of the story I've told, because of this expert-driven type of integration. Of course, the other side of the story is a little bit, in a way, those social categories that actually are excluded from having a say in the European project because, in part, of the history that I have described, because of this particular trajectory of institutionalization of Europe around expert groups. And in a way, this can be easily, shown, and I have colleagues who've done very nice books of political sociology on the ordinary perceptions of Europe, on the fact, one book that calls The Europe of Europeans, of Nicolas Hubé, the delegation. It's translated both into French, but also in English and in German, The Europe of Europeans. And it shows very well that, you would say people from the working class or the lower middle class, which have already a rather low political level of political competence to describe, analyze what's happening in national context, have even more difficulties understanding the EU polity. And why? Because not because EU is more complex, but because these categories usually often use cognitive shortcuts, or are able to use cognitive shortcuts to understand national politics through, professional experiences, family, past political experiences, a number of ways to connect political choices, national political choices, to their own experience, professional, family, etc. And this is, of course, these cognitive shortcuts are, of course, much more difficult to build with the European project, except if you're a farmer, a fisherman, a transnational border, live on the border of countries, and you take advantage of a transnational movement. Except, if you belong to particular categories that actually can relate to their own professional experience to build opinion on what's going on in the European Union. But the fact is, given this definition, expert-driven, if you want, definition of what is the European project, it has come to be very exclusionary. But there's nothing, comment dire, fatal, no? There's no fate about that. There are contexts in which there is a politicization, and large politicization of the European affairs. I don't know about the Brexit referendum, but I think it was actually widely followed, and a lot of people went to vote. And you could say the same about the French referendum 10 years ago that happened on the project of a European constitution. And there was a wide discussion about Europe, and that went way beyond the expert groups, and everybody. There was a poll that was saying in the week before the referendum, 80% of the French people had actually talked about the referendum in family, at work, etc. So you have particular contexts where intermediary groups, associations, ONGs, political parties, journals, actually do the translation work to politicize EU issues into ordinary professional or social life issues that actually to which people can relate, and then this is actually what politicization is about. It's about people, intermediary groups in a democracy able to turn apparently technical issues into highly political, heated debates. And it has happened, but we have to know, again, the social and political conditions that impede today, or that make that politicization particularly difficult today to understand, the current situation of Europe. If we don't understand that history, that expert-driven form of integration, and the type of public sphere that emerge around that, we won't understand why is it that the development of that European project appears to be so exclusionary.
Well, on that semi-happy note.
Okay.
So thank you so
Thank
much.
you for your
and
invitation.
thank you to all of you for coming. There is, as you might have expected, half a glass of wine for everybody, which is next door, and you're all very much invited to join us there. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.